Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to this evening's webinar. Heart Failure Association of India has been organizing a series of webinars thanks to great initiatives taken by our current president, Dr. Hari Krishnan. We did take a short break because of the horrible COVID situation, but as things have eased up, we are back in business and we'll be starting a series of teaching programs once again. Today, we have a very important topic to discuss. We know that a lot of our patients of heart failure with preserved ejection fraction have renal dysfunction, and it's always a challenge to manage these patients. The format is going to be a case discussion, which Dr. Sanjay Mittal will be coordinating the program. And I would like to extend a particularly warm welcome to Professor Rosano, the incoming president of the Heart Failure Association of the European Society of Cardiology. Professor Rosano is an old friend. He's been to our several meetings, and it's always a pleasure to listen to him. Welcome, Giuseppe. And now over to Dr. Sanjay Mittal, who will be coordinating today's program.
Thank you, Dr. Chopra. What I'm going to do today is actually start with a small, short case. And this case is something which is a representative of what we find daily, day in and day out. So this is Mrs. KS, age 65 years, who actually presented to our heart failure clinic in 2017, October. Symptoms of progressive increase in breathlessness and exertion for 3 months. She was a known case of dilated cardiomyopathy with normal coronaries in 2011 and was being on treatment and had a lot of comorbidities, diabetes since 1995, hypertension 2006, CKD stage 4 2011, and she was currently in NYHA class 3. I do agree that this kind of situation is going to be with us in clinics time and again. So what happens today is we rise to a few questions, and this is something which are going to be enlightened to us by our learned speakers in the next few minutes. First, what is the data on heart failure in India? And what is the burden of CKD in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction? Second, Dr. Rosano is going to talk about this. The first topic is going to be covered by Dr. Hari Krishnan. Nobody needs any more introduction to him. He is the president of Heart Failure Association of India and professor of cardiology, SCT, IMST, Trivandrum. The other thing is, the question comes is, what is the latest evidence in management of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction in the setting of chronic kidney disease? And no other than Dr. Rosano is going to deliver the enlightening lecture on this with the latest guidelines and latest evidences. And third question which arises is, how do we manage renal function, renal failure in HFrEF? And this is basically important aspect for us cardiologists, because the nephrologist perspective is going to be presented by Dr. Sunil Prakash, a great friend of ours, who is right now head of the Department of Nephrology and Renal Transplant, BLK Super Specialty Hospital, New Delhi. So not wasting any time, I'll hand over the mic to Dr. Hari Krishnan for his disposition on the magnitude of problem of heart failure in Indian perspective, especially CKD.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Sanjay. Straight away, we will start with the data on heart failure with reduced ejection fraction in India and the burden of CKD in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We have very little data on the CKD, but I will try to present some data from whatever is available. So we know that in the clinical setting, congestive heart failure and CKD often coexist in patients due to the common underlying predisposing factors. Among the cardiorenal syndromes, we are basically going to discuss the first two, type 1 and the type 2, because acute and the chronic cardiorenal syndromes. So an intricate equilibrium between the cardiovascular and the renal system is maintained through renin, angiotensin, aldosterone axis and the autonomic nervous system. So we know that there is a significant interaction. I think this will be discussed. I'm not going to details. Before that, I will go to the burden of heart failure in India. So there is no real data on incidence or prevalence. Estimates are based on extrapolation. So if you estimate the US prevalence in 2019 of 1.8, if you extrapolate to 800 million Indian adults, it will be around 14.4 million, a huge burden facing the already compromised health system in our country. So we will have some estimates. What are the projections? So we know that the heart failure burden increases with age. You can see that 20 to 39 age group, it is very low, 0.3, but it reaches 80 plus. You can see that around 12 to 14% of the patients having heart failure. So we know that the heart failure burden increases with age. In 2011, and the percentage of patients, people with age 60 plus was 8.3. It is going to 21% in 2051. So naturally, as the population is aging, heart failure is going to rise. Risk factors for heart failure, we know that India is the diabetes capital, 69.2 million diabetics in 2015, going to be more than 110 million in 2040. Significant rise in the number of hypertensive patients, and India is next only to US and China in the number of obese people. The coronary artery disease prevalence, you can see that it is similar to the Eastern European country prevalence of coronary artery disease, which is very high. This is an interesting study from Trivandrum where we studied the two group of patients, the same patients in two time periods, in 1993 and 2016. We found that the prevalence of 1.4% has gone up to 3.5 in this 23 years. So there's a significant rise in the coronary artery disease prevalence. Data on all diseases like rheumatic heart disease is still prevalent and contributes to the heart failure burden. Then there are certain etiologies which are more common in the Indian context, like endomyocardial fibrosis, which is endemic in Kerala, emerging infectious disease epidemics like leptospirosis, where 4% had heart failure. Dengue fever, recent data from Trivandrum, 13% had an EF of less than 40. COVID-19, we have emerging data to show that significant number of patients having COVID-related myocardial damage. Pulmonary hypertension due to various etiologies like COPD, infective endocarditis, peripartum cardiomyopathy, aortoarteritis, and anemia, which can contribute or worsen the heart failure, which is very common in this region. So the heart failure in India, we can say that it is double burden because we are the persistence of old age diseases. In addition to that, we have the rise in prevalence of risk factors for the new age diseases. So we will see some of the Indian data on heart failure. The Trivandrum Heart Failure Registry is the one which has a long-term follow-up, started in 2013. This was presented in the late-breaking session in the ESC, European Society of Cardiology Congress, Acute Heart Failure Congress. And then we have the INDER-CHF data, 858 patients from India, the Kerala Heart Failure Registry of 7,500 patients, and Dr. Chopra's registry of from Medanta, 5,500 patients of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We have the Indian College of so registries are coming up with data. We have some data on the National Heart Failure Registry, which we are doing, which has a national representation. You can see the red stars indicate the nodal centers, and the blue stars indicate the participating centers. So each nodal center have 5 participating centers around them to have a regional representation. So we presented this data of 6,437 patients last year in the European Society meeting as a late breaking session. We reported that the age of the patients was 60.5. Men contributed to around 70%. And the majority of the patients were having a heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. This was similar to other Indian registries also, 65 to 67% compared to, this is the European, US data, which shows it is only around 46 to 52%. If you come to preserved ejection fraction, more than 50%, it is only around 12 to 16%, where it is 35 to 46% in the US. So male to female is around 70-30 in Indian studies, but it's 50-50 in the US data. The age profile is interesting. You can see that these are the US data from China, from Europe, all are in the 70s, but you can see the Indian data is 60, 61, 56, 64. So we can say that our Indian patients are 10 to 15 years younger. Coming to the etiologies, ischemic heart disease was the most common etiology. 73% contributed by ischemic heart disease. Dilated cardiomyopathy contributed 17%, and valvular heart disease contributed to around 8%. Totally, these three, ischemic heart disease, dilated cardiomyopathy, and rheumatic valvular heart disease, contributed to around the major burden of heart failure in India. Risk factors, comparing the first Indian data with the European and the US data, you can see that the hypertension is lower, diabetes is almost the same, and the atrial fibrillation is significantly lower, probably because of the lower age of our population. So if you consider guideline-directed therapy as a combination of ACE inhibitor, ARB or ARB plus beta blocker plus ARB in patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, we can see that in 2013, only 24% of the patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction received the therapy. Coming to when in 2020, this has increased to 41.4. That's a good sign, but still only 41% of the patients received guideline-directed therapy. In-hospital mortality in India was higher both in the Trivandrum and the National Heart Failure Registry, almost double of what is seen in the US and Europe. 90-day mortality, it is 17.1. This is a very important slide. You should know that those patients who received guideline-directed therapy, had a very significant benefit in mortality in both the reduced ejection fraction and the mid-range or the mildly reduced, according to the new classification. Both the groups had a significant benefit on receiving these three group of drugs. Coming to the follow-up data, the cumulative mortality at 1 year was 30.8. At 40, it was 45% at 3 years, and the 5-year mortality was very high at 59%. So almost we are losing or 2/3 of our patients at 5 years, which is higher than what is reported from elsewhere. Here also the guideline-directed therapy was persisting. So this is the mortality trend: 30 at 1 year, 45 at 3 years, and around 60% at 5 years. So that to summarize the reduced ejection fraction heart failure data from India, we have the emerging data from the registries. Younger patients by 10 to 15 years, male preponderance, reduced ejection fraction contributed 2/3, 65. Preserved ejection fraction is low, 15% only. 3 etiologies: ischemic heart disease around 70, dilated cardiomyopathy 15, and valvular heart disease contributed to around 6 to 8%. The mortality is high: in hospital 8, 1 year 30, 3 year 45, and 5 year 60%. Now we will see some of the minimal data which is available about CKD in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. This is the data from National Heart Failure Registry. This is unpublished, please don't quote. It is 8.5%. Trivandrum Registry, it is 17%. If you take the Kerala Heart Failure Registry, it is 13%. 13%. The Medanta study, it is 7.8. You can see the US and the other data. It shows that around 18 to 20% of the patients had the renal problems. So there are problems in definition, because if you use GFR, it will be different, as you show in the subsequent slides. If you take the incidence of de novo heart failure in non-CKD, it is around 17 to 21%. So depending upon the stages of renal failure, we can see that in the National Heart Failure Registry, this is 10,851 patients. The CKD prevalence, if you take stage 3, 4, and 5, that is less than 60, it is 48.6%. This is similar to the, or slightly lower than the meta-analysis published in 2012, larger data showing around 55% of reduced ejection fraction had CKD. So, so this is higher than the reported ones because this is based on the calculation of the GFR. Males versus females, males had a higher incidence of chronic kidney disease. And if you take reduced ejection fraction, mid-range, and preserved, probably less prevalence of CKD in the heart failure with reduced ejection fraction group in the Indian data. ACE inhibitor ARB use in CKD, the Trivandrum registry shows that only 21% had ACE inhibitor ARB use, while in non-CKD it is around 54%. So this is an important slide. You can see that in the National Heart Failure Registry, when the stage 4 and 5 heart failure ACE-ARB use was in the tune of around 20 to 27%. The total guideline-directed therapy was around 12 to 15%. So the guideline-directed therapy use comes down when the stage of renal dysfunction goes up. But the renal dysfunction was an important outcome of mortality in the Trivandrum registry, and also it was reported by Dr. Chopra's registry from Medanta. So both showed that renal failure or renal dysfunction is an important predictor of mortality. So to conclude, CKD in heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, 8 to 17% of the patients with reduced ejection fraction have CKD. Males with reduced ejection fraction have more prevalence. The prevalence, the problem in reporting, because GFR is not being used in many of the studies. Guideline-directed therapy improves mortality in Indians, as we have seen with other data of the whole patients. 25 to 40% of the patients only receive guideline-directed therapy overall. CKD stage and 4 and 5, only 12 to 15% receive guideline-directed therapy. CKD is a predictor of mortality and outcomes, and we have to have quality improvement programs aimed at improving the RAS therapy in patients with renal failure. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harikrishnan. I think it was a clear message that nearly 20% of patients with HFrEF have CKD. ARBs or RAS inhibitors are really underutilized in HFrEF with CKD patients. And CKD patients are posing much higher event rates in patients with HFrEF. Thank you. Let's go ahead to hear Dr. Rossano on the fact that what is the management strategies for heart failure in CKD, the latest evidence.
Yes, thank you. And it is a great pleasure to be here with you once again, really privileged. Look, I think I'll start just saying that we have evidence for a foundation therapy in patients with heart failure and reduced ejection fraction. This comes from a wealth of data on ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, MRAs. But also, we know that with these medications, we may affect renal function. We can affect with the ACE inhibitors, the ARBs. We can do with the diuretics, especially in patients with impaired renal function. We have to be wary of the toxic effect of digoxin. The MRAs also can worsen renal function. And sacubitril valsartan as well has an effect on renal insufficiency, albeit that is less than what is expected with the ACE inhibition. The new kids on the block are the SGLT2 inhibitors. These are data from DAPA-HF that clearly demonstrated a 25% in the cumulative event risk of future events, and a significant reduction in risk of death or hospitalizations for heart failure. Similarly, the EMPEROR reduced with empagliflozin showed a reduction in the cumulative endpoints of hospitalizations for heart failure and for mortality. But what was interesting, and this is pertinent to our discussion today, is that there was a clear effect on renal function. Renal function that basically was more preserved with the use of empagliflozin in this case compared to placebo. So basically, there was an initial suggestion from EMPEROR reduced that the SGLT2 inhibitors may also have renal protective effects, and therefore that they can be differentiated from all other antihypertensive, all other heart failure medications, that instead they have they increase the renal dysfunction. However, unlike dapagliflozin, empagliflozin was not been shown to be associated with a reduction in mortality. Now, we know that despite the wealth of evidence, and we see that the uptake of medication is pretty large, And the vast majority of patients, all with ACE inhibitors, ARB, ARNI, and MRAs, are well undertreated. And these are under titration, or the deferral for treatment is associated with a progressive increase in mortality. Because if you see that if there's no referral, there was no increase. If there's a deferral of MRAs, there's a 3% increase. If there's a defer of also beta blockers and MRAs, there's a 7.8% increase in the risk of mortality. And there is an additional 12% increase in 12 additional deaths, so more than doubling the deaths if there is a deferral of initiation of therapies. So it's important to start the foundation therapies as soon as possible. Of course, we have to face the issue of renal function, and we know that there are changes with a worsening of renal function with ACE inhibitors, for example. But if we look at the effects overall on survival, we see that those patients where there was a worsening, an initial worsening of renal function, despite ACE inhibitors, and were kept on ACE inhibitors, they had the same survival of those patients without any worsening of renal function. And you can see here that those patients where the worsening of renal function on placebo had a worse prognosis. So worsening of renal function is associated per se on a worse prognosis, but the development during ACE inhibitors therapy is not associated with a worse prognosis of using ACE inhibitors alone. The other one point that a lot of people on which people focus is the possible effect of hypotension in determining the worsening of renal function. And it has been clearly shown that the worsening of renal function is induced by the degree of congestion, not by the level of blood pressure. So basically that tells us that we need to decongest our patients, and we need to, even if we induce hypotension, that hypotension is not going to worsen the renal function. And in fact, if we look at those patients who have no congestion and no worsening of renal function, they have a slightly better survival of those without congestion and worsening renal function, as we know. But if we look at those with congestion alone, or congestion and worsening of renal function, they have an even worse prognosis. So we have to control congestion. We have to implement medical therapy in order to avoid congestion. Now, of course, these are some tips that we can have in order to try to maintain the maximum dose. Often we look at creatinine. If we have a 15 to 30% increase in creatinine, usually it's a good idea to repeat in 1 or 2 weeks the measurement. Stop the nephrotoxic drug, reduce the diuretic if the edema is not very significant, and other drugs that may reduce systolic blood pressure. If there is more than 30% increase in creatinine, then there is a repeat in assessment in 5 days to a week, and also try to stop all the medications that are not important. Of course, impaired renal function couples with increase in potassium, and I think we can accept some kalemia of up to 5.45 millimoles per liter. And of course, we need to stop some nephrotoxic if there's an increase in hyperkalemia. But now things are changing, because with the approach of hyperkalemia has been changed by the new potassium lowering agents like ZS9 and patiromal. Then a light of hope on our medications, on our anti-heart failure medications, has come from the cardiovascular outcome trials with the SGLT2 inhibitors. These have basically shown that the composite renal endpoints, so the progression towards a worsening of renal function, or the renal dialysis or mortality, was significantly lower in those patients receiving an SGLT2 inhibitors as compared to placebo. And also from DAPA-CKD, we have seen data that mirrored the data that we've seen in AMPEROR reduced, where dapagliflozin was associated with a better prognosis in terms of renal outcomes compared to placebo. So there was attenuated the decline in eGFR, and if started early, had a significant benefit. But what I think was extremely important in establishing this new class of drug in patients with heart failure and CKD was the DAPA-CKD study. It's a large study that included more than 4,000 patients with CKD that were randomized to receive dapagliflozin or placebo. And as you can see, there was a significant, very significant reduction in end-stage kidney disease or cardiovascular death was reduced by 40%. But what was important is that in this case, as in case of the DAPA-HF, there was a significant reduction in overall mortality. So that is important. So I think that when we treat our patients with CKD, we have to use an holistic approach and look at all the different variables that may interfere with CKD, and therefore implement medical therapy according to patient profiles. And this comes from a position paper that was just published by the Heart Failure Association that basically tells us how to implement all the foundation therapy in patients with heart failure. And you can see that in patients with reduced eGFR, but with an eGFR of 60, so just slightly reduced with renal function, but with the potassium of 5.5 and without atrial fibrillation and good blood pressure, then we need to implement all the different medications. As the eGFR worsens, then we have to try to reduce the use of the ACE inhibitors and ARNI, and add the other, possibly, if patients are still asymptomatic, other drugs like hydralazine, azoxystrobinal nitrate, or vericiguat, but always keeping the SGLT2 inhibitors on board. Then if that patient has also an increase in heart rate, then we may wish to think of adding the ivabradine. If it has atrial fibrillation, then maybe wants to add an anticoagulant. Then when we get patients with a more impaired renal function, then of course we have to be more wary. And in those with elevated potassium, then we need to look at the use of potassium binders, as I said. So in conclusion, the new guidelines of the ESC-HFA suggest a fast implementation of the 4 foundation therapies in patients with heart failure. Of course, we understand that that is something difficult to achieve in clinical practice, and especially in patients with CKD, this is often very, very difficult. Now, we know that the SGLT2 improved the renal endpoints in patients with heart failure, in patients with CKD, and in patients with CKD and heart failure, and therefore, if we use a personalized approach, as the one suggested by patient profile, we may be able to optimize our medical therapy for this very difficult group of patients. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Rossano, this was wonderful, very clear. CKD is a problem, and we have to handle the situation as and when it comes into our clinical practice. We'll have a more interaction when we do the case presentation in the panel. I'll now try to hear the nephrologist perspective on this issue of a combination of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction and CKD. Are we cardiologists overtly more afraid of the nephrological perspectives or the creatinine values and eGFR, and how do they handle and suggest to handle the situation in their clinical practice? Dr. Sunil is a nephrologist par excellence. He's going to be deliberating on that topic from the nephrologist perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Mittal. I am very grateful to the Heart Foundation of India, Dr. Chopra, Dr. Mittal, for having me here, and I am dwarfed in presence of such eminent cardiologists. And so, as it may be, and the show must go in next 15 to 20 minutes. I'll take you through the journey of nephrology in these patients who come with a double whammy, a bad heart and a bad kidney, not the best of the world. We are all sick of this slide which pops up in every heart cardiorenal syndrome. I'll just pass by it. Suffice to say that when the heart takes a hit, it may be due to many factors, exogenous factors like contrast, ACE, diuretics, or humorally mediated factors, or instrumentation, or immune factors. Immediately, a lot of things come into play. Kidney injury occurs, that aggravates the heart injury. We all know that. In passing, there are some biomarkers which have not tested the time in full, but they may be of help to us. And we have to look at this picture from both sides, from the heart and the kidney. So what is the magnitude of the problem? My predecessors have spoken about it. And after seeing a couple of data, I would say that type 1 cardiorenal syndrome with AKI and ACS, the data is between 17 to 34% in different studies. However, in clinical practice, this is a fairly common problem. And some degree of renal function dysfunction you will find in every third patient. And it is true, friends, that cardiorenal syndrome, most important determination of outcome, to my mind, prejudiced I may be as a nephrologist, is the baseline renal functions. So we really need to have a handle on it. Some trials in passing, you all know them better than me. CHARM, Candy-Sartain trial, which showed that GFR less than 60 mils per minute was a strong indicator predictor of all-cause mortality for patients of heart failure. Then ESCAPE trial evaluation, again with the heart failure and CATH studies, confirmed renal insufficiency was associated with worse outcomes like death or rehospitalization. And then the very popular SOLVE trial laid down that moderate CKD defined as GFR less than 60 mils per minute was an independent factor for all-cause mortality, the 3-point MACE basically. So friends, the prevalence of renal dysfunction in many studies was about 1/3. And it is also prudent to remember that 33% increase of mortality accrues by increase of creatinine by 1 milligram %. So it is a dicey situation. So I put in all these big studies here, and what these studies tell you over time is they are fairly big studies, fairly good numbers. Some studies have about 60,000 patients, some has about 3,000-4,000 patients, and they have divided them according to GFRs. Etiologies are out there. And what they tell us is that if the GFR is less than 60 mils per minute, the risk is 39%. And if the GFR is further down, the hazard risk is much, much higher. Just to, let's say, the ANCHOR study, it shows that the hazard ratio was 1.39 when the GFR was between 30 to 45, stage 3 CKD basically. And 39% was the prevalence when the GFR was less than 60. So I would say that even mild to moderate decrease in renal function has been shown to correlate very well with morbidity and mortality of these patients. Nay, they may be asymptomatic or symptomatic congestive heart failure patients. I'll pass by it. You know better than me, I insult, cardiac dysfunction, neurohumoral activation, hemodynamic decompensation, kidney gets hit. Eventually you are loaded with fluid, and that is, to my mind, the crux of the problem from a nephrologist point of view. Some renal biomarkers, NGAL, cystatin C, and albuminuria, you all know. Then cardiac markers, you know better than me. What I would like to say is that if you look at cystatin C, which to my mind is more sensitive than serum creatinine, we have to start looking at cystatin C along with albuminuria because they have a better prognostic value, especially if you combine them with cardiac markers. And about meta-analysis of some 10 studies showed that NGAL can also be useful in predicting need of dialysis and or death. I will just impeach in your turf, ARNI. Paradigm heart failure has clearly shown that SECU and Welsard combination reduce the decrease in EGFR compared to ACE in CKD patients. Mind it, all these things of the studies I am quoting from CKD specifically. Although in Paradigm there was a modest increase of proteinuria, but yet the benefits accrued. In HARP-3 trial, they compared ARNI with irbesartan and they in CKD obviously, and they showed ARNI was as good as irbesartan in reducing proteinuria and improving blood pressure control. So in this study, the proteinuria was reduced, contrary to little bit rise in Paradigm. So ARNI should be preferred over ACE-ARB. We as nephrologists also feel to treat heart failure. And many studies have shown that it does not cause much hyperkalemia, maybe less than ARBs, reduces cardiovascular death, better hospitalization rates. And with new emerging potassium binders, as Professor Ozano pointed out, like patiromer and zirconium, hyperkalemia will become less of a headache for you and for us, and they may be more used. Obviously, you should always try patient to eat the right diet, which improves the quality of life. And needless to say that a good interaction between cardio and nephros will give you better outcomes. Now, I was surprised, but that is fortuitously true, that risk of hyperkalemia was lower when MRAs were combined with ARNIs. As an nephrologist, I've been terribly afraid of putting in MRAs, RAILS trial and so many other trials, and we see a lot of hyperkalemia coming in emergencies in very dicey situation. But the data suggests that in ARNIs, they had less hyperkalemia, 17% to 18.7, and the hazard ratio was also less. Severe hyperkalemia was also less with ARNI compared to enalapril, 4.5 to 61%, and the hazard ratio was also favoring ARNI. A word about MRAs. In Emphasis heart failure trial, 33% patients had a GFR less than 60. So they were in basically CKD3, and the primary endpoints were same. Hyperkalemia was certainly a concern, but again, as we know, that with zirconium and patiromer coming in, it will become a less of a concern. And you can use much more freely in symptomatic patients who have elevated BNP. These are the clues in which it can be given with less of a fright. GFR better than 30, creatinine less than 2.5, and starting potassium, if it is less than 5, will be good. Here I will give you a practical tip. Friends, whenever you are giving MRA with ACE-ARB, at least tell them not to eat low sodium salts. In India, people are very, very fond of eating Lona salt, Kala Namak, Senda Namak. It's used in fasting in India, and you are well aware that it contains potassium. So by reducing the low sodium salts, like Tata Light, etc., you will have a better handle on hyperkalemia. Again, you are aware of this fascinating study which broke through 5 months back, and it showed that when you are combining finerenone with comparing finerenone in this multi-center randomized double-blind trial, and it found that finerenone gave you better cardiac outcomes and a better renal outcomes. 17% of problems compared to 21%, hazard risk was 0.82, and secondary cardiac outcomes were also better. So renal primary outcomes, secondary cardiac outcomes favored finerenone over placebo on state-of-the-art therapies. So there was a room for ending finerenone, and you all know very well that it stands to advantage compared to eplerenone and aldosterone. Beta blockers has been there for n number of years. MERIT-HF trial, SENERS trial, CBS with bisoprolol showed benefits of beta blockers. 6 major meta-analyses with beta blockers in CKD and heart failure have shown beta blockers significantly reduce the risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular mortality. I believe beta blockers should be a part of heart failure prescription, and that is the reason. In the CKD 4-5 situation, please bring up your attention on this last bar slide. You find that a beta blocker has clearly shown moderate benefits. Mind it, this is for CKD 4-5 with heart failure. Even CRT, ICDs, ISDN, Ivabrat, MRA, ARNI, ACE have not shown clear-cut benefits, but beta blocker stands there and it should be in use. In a nutshell, I would say at the bedside today, over 90% of all hospitalization for acute decompensated heart failures, tongue in cheek, are due to fluid overload. And the majority of these patients do not respond to oral diuretics, and that is why perhaps they are in the hospital. So we obviously start with diuretics, and they remain the cornerstone in heart failures with or without cardiorenal syndrome, but they have no effect on mortality. Torsemide now is finding more favor over age-long furosemide because of its long-acting, higher bioavailability, pharmacokinetics. But friends, drug resistance becomes an important issue because the tubules get hypertrophy and some other reasons also. Whenever you are facing drug resistance, you will be tempted to give continuous high-dose loop therapy. And it has been shown that earlier we were afraid of using high-dose loop therapy because we were afraid that it will trigger RAS inexorably. But DOSE AHF trial and CARES-H heart failure trial showed that the RAS activation was no greater with high-dose loop diuretics compared to low-dose loop diuretics. Ultrafiltration, in fact, which we nephrologists come into play, however, resulted in more plasma renin activity than stepwise diuretic step up. We'll talk about it in a little while. So, to enhance diuresis and to correct worsening renal functions, sometimes thiazide like metazolone are added. Addition of acetazolamide at the proximal tubular level, friends, I think is theoretical. Constant loop diuretics will help. Physiological doses of vasopressin antagonists came with a big bang, but they have gone out with a whimper. Adenosine receptor blockers, extracorporeal devices, ultrafiltration are there. You know better than me about assist devices. So all these things, especially basically diuretics, are out there with or without ultrafiltration. Vasopressin went out. In active trial, it suggested a 60-day mortality. But in Everest trial, it did not show any benefit. And in our clinical practice also, we find that although it improves short-term weight loss by causing free water loss, by causing V1 receptor stimulation, it counteracts its benefit at V2 receptor. And although whenever you want a free water loss, you can achieve only by vasopressin, furosemide, and a good colon. Adenosine receptor antagonists were vogue in early 2000s because adenosine, you know, causes afferent arterial vasoconstriction in the kidneys and cause increased proximal tubular sodium reabsorption. So adenosine receptor antagonists like rolophilene, a selective adenosine receptor antagonist, facilitated the diuresis and preserved renal function, but it has not stood the test of the time in this decade. Similarly, for nesiritide, natriuretic peptides like ANP and BNP, we know are released in response to myocardial stretch, which is a consequence of the failing heart, and they serve to counterbalance the negative effects of RAS by increasing natriuresis, causing vasodilatation and suppressing RAS. But the fusion trial follow-up series of nesiritide was a randomized trial of nesiritide with placebo. There was no evidence of renal harm. However, no benefit accrued either. And ASCENT heart failure trial, which came 2-3 years down, did not show any benefit over placebo. So nesiritide has interest is also quiescent here. Renalase, a kidney-produced hormone, regulates cardiac function and BP. Metabolized catecholamine has a powerful hypotensive effect, but still it is at the lab level. So today, current options, what are the current options? When you give diuretics, you achieve a better output. It reduces total body water because furosemide and torsemide causes free water loss. But the adverse effects, you know, are activation of RAS, myocardial aldosterone uptake is increased, and the myocyte loses potassium, magnesium, and calcium, which causes problem in worsening pump function, reducing cardiac output, increased total resistance, reduced natriuresis, and mortality may be adversely affected. So we have to sometime land up on ultrafiltration. We are called there. There are long-term controversies sitting there. Ultrafiltration, the thing with ultrafiltration is that it will remove more sodium than diuretics. This is what we have to remember, because furosemide causes free water loss, but ultrafiltration will cause isotonic loss, and therefore electrolyte disturbances will be less. ECF volume will be much rapidly reduced. In the Euphoria trial, early ultrafiltration reduced the fluid overload and permitted the early discharge of high-risk ADHF patients in less than 3 days, which was a good achievement. A treatment strategy to use ultrafiltration early may do the trick in volume overloaded, rather waiting right till the end. And evidence of diabetic resistance, if it is coming up, then you may land up with ultrafiltration maybe earlier. Improvements in clinical status at 90 days have been shown in many trials. In UNLOAD trial, ultrafiltration versus IV diuretics for hospitalized congestive cardiac failure was a prospective randomized trial, and it concluded that early ultrafiltration produced greater weight loss. Early ultrafiltration study reduced 90 days survival. Patient required less re-hospitalization, less days of hospital, and emergency visits were reduced. But however, there was a big disconnect between clinical well-being and weight loss. In passing, this is our domain, but in passing, we must remember that when you're using ultrafiltration, that intravascular space, the blood space, the rate of fluid removal, which we call ultrafiltration rate, UFR, should never exceed the plasma refill rate. When we remove fluid from the blood, it is refilled from the interstitial compartment, which gets it from the intracellular fluid movements. If you make it a very rapid filling removal, and the PRR is unable to catch up with you, you will come to grief. Equodex Flex device is one of the devices which will help you in making less mistakes, controls blood pressure, controls blood volume, will give you precise fluid removal. You can set it up in less than 10 minutes, and it can help us. I will change gears from fluid, ultrafiltration, and gears and talk about anemia, which is very dear to all nephrologists. And I am very happy to know that now cardiologists are also getting into this business of treating anemia aggressively. So we know that in GFR, when it is less than 60, anemia is a big issue. And it is like egg and hen. As the CKD worsens, anemia worsens. As the anemia worsens, there is hypoxia of tubular cells, more tubular interstitial damage, and the heart failure progresses. Maybe also because RBC are antioxidants, and oxidative stress contributes to glomulosclerosis. Iron deficiency, friends, has been shown to be very, very common in chronic kidney disease with heart failure and chronic heart failure without kidney disease. In DOPS, this was a CKD trial. The prevalence of anemia was, iron deficiency was very severe. But what I found last time was that in heart failure patients, 50% of patients were iron deficient, even if there was no anemia. For example, 50% patient had iron deficiency and anemia, and 33% patient had iron deficiency without anemia. So just looking at hemoglobin in your heart failure patient, you may not do full justice. I repeat, 50% of heart failure patient NYHA 1 to 4 were iron deficient. So now we know enough about cardiorenal syndrome, but we now also talk about cardiorenal anemia syndrome. And on top,
Dr. Sunil, may I request you to...
I'll wait. Yeah, so cardiorenal anemia, now we talk about cardiorenal anemia iron deficiency syndrome, which is CRADES. And it shows that if CRADES is there, your mortality is very high. This is a FAIR-HF trial where you gave iron, the symptomatology improved, and these are European guidelines that you must give IV iron to these patients. And a word about vascular calcification in CKD patient, the heart suffers badly, and the phenotype of the vascular smooth muscle changes. You need to know something about inhibitors of these calcifications. So friends, there are a lot of things which are going wrong in this combination. Lots and lots of things we need to get a handle, and perhaps on all of those things. And the paradigm shift has come because of the SGLT2 inhibitors. And we all know it has been talked about very clearly and lucidly by my predecessors. So I'll just roll over. DAPA CKD trial is very dear to us, and it showed a lot of all-cause mortality benefits, dialysis reduction, and secondary outcome benefits. And even in non-diabetic CKDs, we had enough benefits, and in IgA nephropathy, now we are using it. So in the end, friends, I will end here, but let's not forget the basics. Whenever there is problem with fluid removal, we forget the salt restriction, we forget the fluid intake the patient is taking. So please take a handle on salt, fluid, protein intake, better anemia, hypertension, diabetes management. Look at the bones, because if the bones lose calcium, it goes in the heart, combat hypercoagulability and change lifestyles. Thank you. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil, for the nephrologist perspective on heart failure treatment. I'll go back to my case and we'll actually go ahead with the panel discussion on the same perspective. Let me introduce the panelists first. We have Dr. Rosano, our good old friend, Dr. Hari Krishnan, Dr. Sunil Prakash. Along with these three stalwarts, we'll have Dr. Soumitra Ray, who's going to join us. He's the Director, Invasive Cardiology from AMRI Hospital, Kolkata, and Dr. Uday Jadhav, who is the Senior Consultant Cardiology in MGM New Bombay Hospital from Mumbai. Both of them are genuine academicians, heart failure experts, and cardiologists, would not require any further introduction. So let's go ahead with the case here. This lady we talked about had a blood pressure of 100 by 70 millimeters of mercury. Pulse rate was 68 beats per minute. JVP was elevated, had bilateral pedal edema and basal crackles. She was, as I said, NYHA class 3. ECG showed right bundle branch block and sinus rhythm. Echo had ejection fraction of 25%, global hypokinesia, moderate functional mitral regurgitation, and elevated end diastolic pressure in the form of pseudonormal mitral inflow pattern with a PA pressure of 45 millimeters of mercury. The biochemical parameters at the presentation was anemia. The TLC was normal, platelet was okay. The urea was normal, but the creatinine was elevated, 2.9 milligram per DL. Sodium was normal, potassium was okay. Urinary albumin was practically negligible. Trace albuminuria was there. UACR was 146 milligram per gram of creatinine. eGFR was as less as 20 ml per minute. The NT-proBNP was expectedly elevated to 4,500 picogram per ml. And we also, because of the hemoglobin, as Dr. Sunil was mentioning, are very particular about the iron assessment. And there was severe ferritin deficiency. Iron was just 15 microgram per DL, and transferrin saturation was as low as 4.37. The thyroid profile was okay, and HbA1c was decently controlled. In this situation, we were alarmed that the medications she was receiving was metoprolol succinate 25 milligrams twice a day, aspirin, atorvastatin, understanding that aspirin and as well as atorvastatin in non-ischemic cardiomyopathy is hardly any role. Isosorbide mononitrate as well, along with a small dose of telmisartan, amiodarone, and furosemide were being given. And the diabetes was requiring linagliptin 5 milligrams. So what we did is we rectified the iron deficiency by giving ferric carboxymaltose of 1.5 grams over 3 days, 1 gram and then 0.5 grams. We stopped her aspirin, nitrate, statins, and amiodarone, swapped Lasix to 20 milligrams of torsemide twice a day to decongest, increased metoprolol succinate to 50 milligrams twice a day, continued linagliptin, and stopped telmisartan and started ARNIs. Here, understanding this was in 2017, when SGLT2 inhibitors were not there, the question which arises is, how safe is it to convert ARBs to ARNIs with eGFR less than 20? Minded at that time, it was Paradigm HF trial only, and the recommendations which had come up and certain data from SGLT2 inhibitors. I'll start this question with Dr. Uday, if he's here, if he can show some light. Is this justified to actually convert telmisartan to ARNI in that side? Dr. Sunil did mention about his opinion, but Dr. Uday, can you show some light on this? Dr. Uday, is he here? I don't see him. Dr. Soumitra Ray, can you throw some light? Is it justifiable? Would you do
yes,
that?
Dr. Mittal, thank you. ARNI is nothing but a combination of ARB and neprilysin inhibitor. So as far as kidney and potassium are concerned, you are comparing one ARB with another ARB. So I don't see any fundamental difference of shifting to ARNI, that is from telmisartan to valsartan, as long as you are getting a host of other benefits coming as a package to the ARNI without affecting the kidney. Otherwise, what was a telmisartan was already doing. So if the patient was stable on telmisartan, I don't see any harm in changing him to a HART to ARNI. Rather, you invite all the other benefits to the patient in the form of ARNI, which telmisartan alone failed to give. So there is every reason to change this patient ARB to ARNI, but I would be careful about the equivalence of doses, as the blood pressure is 100 systolic pressure. So we have to be careful that we are not giving an extra dose of ARB because she was taking about telmisartan 20 or 40 milligram a day. So you have to give an equivalent dose. I would rather start an ARNI of 50 milligram twice rather than 100 or 200. And of course, we'll keep an eye on the potassium and creatinine.
Dr. Rosano, what's your take on it? Would you do that with such a low EGFR?
Absolutely not. It's completely contraindicated, and it's in the SPC, and it's a contraindication. I wouldn't do it.
Yeah, even though that person was on ARB still, Dr. Sunil was also mentioning, I mean, would we stop the ARNIs or ARNIs and ARBs here, or what?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, there is a reason of reducing the ARBs, but there's no reason to start the ARNI because it's contraindicated. If anything happens, then you're legal responsible for that.
Let's hear Dr. Sunil. Dr. Sunil, what you have to say as a nephrologist?
The problem that I face is that it's very difficult to contain their blood pressure head. They come to our outpatient with a pressure systolic head of 90, so that throws the spanner in the works. And that is perhaps what Professor Gisipi is talking about. Because you see, she's sitting at 100 systolic and you put in ARNI there, there's some vasodilatation, there's valsartan there. That tolerance of, if you are able to maintain the pressure at systolic pressure rate, then there will not be a problem. Because potassium will not be a problem, because in any case, whatever potassium has to accrue from ARB. The neprilysin component will not affect the potassium. And nowadays we can easily have better potassium binding drugs. But I am always worried about the systolic head of these patients whenever they get ARNI, because they have bad heart, they have bad blood pressure.
Dr. Uday and Dr. Hari, Dr. Uday first.
Yeah, a couple of questions. So this is a non-ischemic patient, right? It's a non-ischemic dilated cardiomyopathy. Yeah. So, and the EF is very low. So I would have two questions posed to myself. Number one is, will the benefit of ARNI in this subset of patients, I know there have been data from the studies, but in real life clinical practice, is the benefits conferred same as in ischemic cardiomyopathy versus non-ischemic cardiomyopathy? And second, if these patients are due for a ICD or a CRT, would ARNI make a difference in terms of sparing anything?
Dr. Hari, would you agree or not agree to this?
Yeah, I think I will be very careful in shifting to ARNI. Because many a times when we start these patients on, they will drop their pressures and they will go into all problems of hypotension and all. So I will be very careful. I will be careful in shifting over to ARNI.
Right. So the reason why we decided to do that, because the person was being treated by an endocrinologist in our hospital, a nephrologist, because the person was already in CKD, and us. We had a conference and said that we should try with a very low dose. She was already on nitrates for, I don't know, God knows what reason, not in isolazine or a combination of hydralazine and nitrates. It was only nitrates. So we withdrew that, and then we added this thing with a constant watch. She was in the hospital when we did it, and we were watching the renal profile and vitals and all those things, and that's how we had a convincing discussion with the patient that we are trying this. If you don't tolerate, we'll withdraw it, while she was in the hospital. That's how we started it. So the other question which comes is, what precautions should we take? As Dr. Sunil did mention, hypokalemia is less of a chance or risk, but we will still be watching that. Hypotension is something which we should be watching that. And also the fact that the worsening of renal function may be there. Okay, if not this, what else? At this pressure, what else could have been done to improve? This person presents to us with NYHA class 3, worsening dyspnea for 2-3 months, congestive physiology, pressure was borderline, and there were certain drugs she's not supposed to be taking, and iron deficiency. We did iron. Anything else which could be done? Anybody? I mean, suggestions, just because it's from my database, which we have taken out the case.
What about the SGLT2 inhibitor? Any thoughts on that?
So this was in 2017. That time, DEPA-HF also hadn't come, and the diabetologists.
Okay.
You know, the funny thing today, the drug started from diabetologist group, and today they are the most scared people to start it in a heart failure population. Yes. Cardiologists have come ahead of the endocrinologists to use dapagliflozin in this situation. And to my dismay, or to my surprise, the most prominent people who actually promote use of dapagliflozin or SGLT2 inhibitors is the nephrologist today. So
the other thing is that probably telmisartan is not the best ARB for heart failure. So probably should stop that and may give a little losartan. That is the one that probably is the least effective on blood pressure, or even better, maybe a very low dose of candesartan would be preferable.
Right.
What is the nephrology view of giving torsemide 20 milligram twice daily? Is this reasonable diuresis, or are we over diureting this patient?
No, I would say 20 milligram torsemide is fairly good dose, sir. But most of the time, we in our busy clinic practice, we are not looking at the amount of sodium the patient is taking and amount of the fluid which ensues. So many times, I'm telling you, when in these dialysis patients, if you spend 10 minutes with them, with your dietitian, with the renal dietitian, get a handle on his sodium and fluid, lot of your issues will be solved. But we tend to jack up their furosemide, we tend to jack up their diuretics, and that doesn't give you much output. So from a nephrologist point of view, we need to really look into their diets, their sodiums, and their water. But 20 PD-2 is a good dose with this creatinine. With this GFR, you will have a good diuresis. But if you keep on putting in more, then what's happening?
Yeah, actually the patient was congested as per the case history. So she required some washout. What I think also is that even today, even not 2017, if it is 2021, it would have been perhaps difficult to start SGLT2 because the DCGI permission is still 30, eGFR 30. Below 30, it's not approved to start SGLT2 inhibitor in India. It varies from country to country. Even if EMPA heart failure is with 25, the 25 eGFR was the inclusion criteria, the cutoff. But still, but Indian standard, it is 30 still. It was 45 a few months ago. Now it is 30. So with 20 eGFR, as Professor Rosano was saying, most of the things are contraindicated by medical legal things. So I don't know. But Professor Rosano, may I ask you one thing? All the trials had got the cutoff of eGFR during inclusion. But while on study, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the road, when the eGFR was declining, was there any cutoff when the drug was withdrawn or the patient was taken out of the study because eGFR was declining?
Usually it should have been stopped if the eGFR was below 30. So it's, but yet, I mean, here if you're going to convert, I mean, that is a clear contraindication to convert.
But in EMPEROR reduced, they went down to eGFR of 20.
Yeah. Yeah, but yes, I mean, this is still lower, so it's you cannot start the ARNI.
And the other thing is that if the gut is congested, as it would be in this patient, toracimide is a better diuretic than furosemide because its absorption is better and its bioavailability is better. There's a lot of variation in the absorption of oral furosemide in congested gut.
Is there any cutoff for ARB or ACE inhibitor as far as EGFR is concerned?
Pardon?
Is there any cutoff for ARB or ACE inhibitor as far as EGFR is concerned?
Yeah, there's concern in starting. The problem is that it's here you will be just switching from one ARB to another, but it's which probably doesn't give you any big problem in terms of medical legal. 30 is usually 30 or 20 according to the different ACE inhibitors and different ARBs is the threshold of not starting.
So let me go ahead with the case. So how the person within a week improved symptomatically. 1 week later, the creatinine actually dropped down to 2.7 milligram per deciliter, and EGFR marginally improved, probably because of the drop in creatinine. Potassium was maintained, blood pressure actually improved to 110 millimeters systolic, and the pulse rate was 66 beats per minute. And at that point in time, we increased the ARNIs to 100 milligrams twice a day. And this is what I had drawn the complete chart. Every 3 months, the follow-up was there. The systolic blood pressure actually tend to improve over a period of time, over the first few months. The pulse rate settled down because of beta blockers. Weight was absolute constant, marginal increase, because these patients who actually I send, they report back to me every week with the BP weight percentage charts, and every 2 weekly RFT reports, which includes the potassium and creatinine. So the potassium did go up a little bit at this point in time. The creatinine was absolute level, no major change. And the NYHA class actually slowly improved, with becoming almost completely asymptomatic. EGFR improved to almost 23, and then there was a dip here. At this point in time, we did change something, because that means the ARNI was not being tolerated 100 milligrams twice a day. We decreased the dose of ARNI because there was a dip, because possibly this was in June of 2018, where the person might have had a little bit of dehydration. And so we actually reduced the dose of ARNIs. On the period of these 3 months, you can see the diuretic dose had come down from 20 milligrams a day to almost no, or 2.5 milligrams. That was alternate of 5 milligrams a day. And I had educated the patient to actually adjust the diuretic dose in accordance to morning weight, which the patient was reporting to us. So at this point in time, what we found that there was a change here, and the drop in the ARNI dose was there, which made the person pick up the blood pressure again from this drop. The EGFR again picked up, and also the diuretic dose was practically negligible. We were able to increase the ARNI back to 100 milligrams twice a day at this level, and this was sustained for next complete 1 year. In August 2019, and you can see that, where we were in October 2019, we were actually thinking of getting it better. So we tried to increase the ARNIs to 200 milligrams twice a day to the maximum dose. The blood pressure was allowing us here. It was around 116 millimeters of mercury. At that point in time, we tried to increase the dose of ARNIs to 200 milligrams. But what we found was, by doing that, there was the EGFR was maintained, but the blood pressure did drop. So that is why we had to actually reduce it back to 100 milligrams twice a day at this point in time, and hardly any diuretic usage practically, which was there. So this was something which at this point in time in February 2021, till that time we were managing on ARNIs. And despite the fact that we had the results of DEPA-HF trial, and EMPEROR reduced trial, and even DEPA-CKD, we did not have the courage to start this thing. At the point in nearly February of 2021, telephonically we heard that the patient had drop in blood pressure, and the EGFR also had a drop, and the person was feeling symptomatically NYHA class 2 or 3 because of a little bit of congestion. So at that point in time, we had to drop the ARNI dose here. We can see it is just 50 milligrams twice a day. We had also to lower the beta blocker dose at that time because of the subtle drop in blood pressure as well as the EGFR. And at that point in time, when the person stabilized in 2-3 weeks time, was the time when the nephrologist was the treating nephrologist was the person who prompted to start on the SGLT2 inhibitors. So with a big concern, educating the patient properly, we started 5 milligrams of dapagliflozin at this point in time. Although the EGFR was still about 23s, 24s, and mind it, at this point in time, the promoter of SGLT2 inhibitor was the nephrologist rather than the cardiologist. And till that time, the last follow-up has been in June of 2021, just 2 weeks back, and the person is doing absolutely fine with no further episodes of this thing. Current status, NYHA class 1, 2, stable.
Professor Rosano has to leave in a minute.
Yeah, so I'm stopping sharing. This is the final slide.
Comments before he.
Yeah, this is the final slide. The creatinine latest is 2.6 with EGFR of 23. Potassium is fine. Ejection fraction has improved to 40%. NT-proBNP is down to 411, and we are continuing 50 milligrams and SOS of 5 milligrams of torsemide, 50 milligrams twice a day of ARNIs, and dapagliflozin 5 milligrams. So here is the question for Dr. Rosano. Dr. Rosano, I know it's something which is not there in the clinical trials, and on the basis of clinical trials, we devise what we use or what we recommend for clinical use. But in situations like this, in your clinical practice, what would be the EGFR you would ever try to put the patient on for SGLT2 inhibitors?
You're muted.
You're muted.
The SGLT2 inhibitors, there's data now coming from the DAPA-CKD that show that even patients who are in list for dialysis, they will improve and they will actually lengthen the time to dialysis. So basically, there's no limit. I mean, on the SPC, there will be 20 as limit, but there is evidence of clear survival benefit even in those patients below.
Right. The other thing is the acute kidney injury, which is again a secondary problem of SGLT2 inhibitor initiation. What is the concern and how do we handle that situation, sir, in the clinical practice?
It's much less than with ARNI or with ACE inhibitors. I wouldn't regard as a problem.
Okay, and the third thing is that EMPEROR reduced as well as DEPA-HF as far as the CKD, DEPA-CKD trial, which is a preferred SGLT2 inhibitor in your suggestion. Is it empagliflozin, dapagliflozin, or now sotagliflozin also? I mean, if you can throw some light on sotagliflozin results also on which were published in January.
The dapagliflozin has shown to reduce mortality in both DAPA-HF and DAPA-CKD. So I would prefer a drug that reduces mortality over a combined endpoint. But of course, we will have to look on other trials coming. And sotagliflozin has shown similar effect as the dapagliflozin, but also extended to an ejection fraction to greater than 50%. So that is something that should lead us to have a good hope for the preserved ejection fraction trials. Now,
right. Yeah.
Okay.
A word about the tubulo-glomerular feedback with SGLT2 inhibitors. I mean, is it responsible for the renal benefits, or do you have some other ideas about it?
There are several mechanisms that have been proposed. There's effect on potassium hydrogen exchange, on cardiac metabolism, and on inflammation. So for sure, it's not just one. So there are many, and whoever tells you that knows one mechanism is lying, because there's likely to be more than one.
Right. I understand you have to leave to.
Yes, unfortunately, yes. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Rosano. I think we'll continue with for next few minutes. We have Dr. Soumitra Ray and Abhay Yadav and Dr. Sunil Prakash. Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.
So, Dr. Yadav, about the case, could we do something else? Do you agree with starting with SGLT2 inhibitors at this point in time, with no recommendations of the EGFR less than 25 for dapagliflozin?
Right. Because you don't have many choices as of now, and looking at the way SGLT2 inhibitors have behaved, it's sensible. It's sensible that one can put that in practice and things may work. Looking at least the DAPA-CKD data, I'm very optimistic. Now, having said that, I have one or two specific observations. So this is a salutary effect, right? The LVEF as one of the parameters is substantially improved. So what's going on here over the last 2 or 3 years in this patient? Do you think that there is a good impact on the LV remodeling, and do you think that Arni has done it, or what's going on? You are expert in echo, so I'm sure you have studied all the hemodynamic,
yes,
endoscopic volumes, LA, this, that. So, I mean, do you find this sort of salutary difference because of Arni, or is there something else that contributed? And this is a non-ischemic cardiomyopathy.
Yes, this is non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. And in my opinion, it was a combination of everything. We escalated the dose of beta blockers. We maintained that good heart rate control, and blood pressure was very decently controlled and regulated as a part of education, plus the ARNIs. I believe ARNI should have had a role, because earlier than that, it was telmisartan, and also not forgetting that we had rectified the iron deficiency also at that. So many things which we did, which possibly could have played a role. There was a question in the question bank when I was looking at it: why stop the amiodarone? Because the person was an amiodarone. Why do we stop the amiodarone? That is a good question. I mean, we did it because we escalated dose of beta blockers, thinking that anti-arrhythmic properties of beta blockers will suffice for amiodarone. And also, amiodarone is not a good drug for heart failure for the long term with so many side effects. I am reserving it only for people where nothing else would be available. And also, addition of ARNI was also a fact, because it also is supposedly reducing the sudden cardiac deaths and ventricular arrhythmias to that extent. Dr. Soumitra Ray, would you agree with stopping amiodarone, or would you have a reservation on doing that?
I didn't find any reason to start amiodarone in the first place.
Well, the patient came to us with amiodarone, so that's why.
That's what I think. So it was somebody's mistake, but we should not carry on with the mistake. Yes. We have done the right thing to stop it in the first place. This is an absolutely toxic drug, and very, very coveted use, very, very limited use. And we are not thinking of anything to give amiodarone. Even if you think the ICD is an indication for all patients below ejection 30%, though that is debated now. But again, amiodarone has got nothing to do in that situation as well. So it is either ICD or not. So what is amiodarone doing over here? I don't know. So you have done the best thing possible to stop the amiodarone in the first place. So I have got no reservation in stopping amiodarone over here. Yeah. I was rather thinking about the SGLT2 inhibitor. We should scan the SGLT2 inhibitor into 3 separate compartments. With failing renal function, what is lost is its anti-diabetic property.
Yes.
But it has got nothing to do with here about diabetes and SGLT2 inhibitor. Second thing is the anti-heart failure property is maintained by the molecule itself, nothing to do with kidney or renal function. And thirdly, the renal function itself is improved by SGLT2 inhibitor whatever the renal level you are giving it. So I find every reason to give SGLT2 inhibitor in this case, because the heart failure is the main concern here, and second is kidney. Diabetes is nowhere in the picture. I mean, diabetes is not at all, just Trajenta 5S, and that is doing on for last 3 years. Your sugar is fantastically controlled. So nothing to do with diabetes. So I am absolutely happy in giving SGLT2 inhibitor over here. Rather, I'd say over in this case that heart failure, as Dr. Jadhav was saying, did you see just the ejection fraction improve? Fine, but did the heart tone down? There's a volumes decreased.
Yes, the volumes did decrease, and even mitral regurgitation, which was moderately severe at that time, reduced to just 1+. The left atrial size marginally improved, but the biggest thing was the LV size, dimensions reduced, and the volumes decreased, and the ejection fraction improved.
Yeah,
Dr. Chopra might say that we sometimes are limited by the medico-legal issues, as Dr. Rozan was very concerned about medico-legal issues, of course. But there are intuitive medicine as well. I mean, we know that it will work. There is just not enough data collected, or the trial is not designed in that way. But everything points that it will work. So in a desperate situation, what would you do? Will you restrain the medicine, or will you take your chance?
Yeah.
Dr. Chopra?
So just a few days back in the annual conference of Heart Failure Association, there were a number of presentations on SGLT2 inhibitors. And in one of them, in which there were some important people who took part in that debate, discussion, they mentioned that so long as a person is not on dialysis, you can use SGLT2 inhibitors. Use it carefully, but because, by virtue of the fact that it improves renal function, prevents deterioration. And in Emperor Reduced trial, we used it up to 20 GFR. It was used, and a lot of people tolerated it. So, I think it is still an evolving field. And you remember we started off with some eGFR of 60 or 70, then came down to 40, then 30, and now it is 20. And now they're saying that if a person is not on dialysis, you can use it. So let's see what time shows. And the other thing is, Dr. Mittal, in your presentation, please don't place this patient in NYHA class 1. She will never be in class 1. In that chart, it was dipping down from class 2 to class 1. At best, if she's in class 2, she'll be very lucky, but never in class 2.
Whatever.
That message should go out very clearly.
She has limited her lifestyle.
Yeah, so it's a relative phenomenon. So, Dr. Sunil, one question for you. Somebody has asked in the chat box, what is the indication or contraindication of ARBs as far as GFR is concerned?
Yes,
in your perspective, would 20 ml per minute of GFR would be a contraindication for ARBs? Let's not talk about ARNIs.
I have to answer that.
Yes.
Yeah. See, as far as I'm concerned, if a patient is already on ACE-ARBs, then the GFR issue is not so relevant because of the potential beneficial effects on the heart. Ultimately, heart is the heart of the matter. As a nephrologist, you see, because the only thing that bothers us is potassium, because that is the big issue. So if there are many patients who with even a creatinine of 6, who are on the cusp of dialysis, they may continue to tolerate ACE-ARB very well. If you can have a handle on potassium, and in my mind, they should not be taking low sodium salts, which is loaded with potassium. They should take less salt, and now with zirconium and patiromer just round the corner, this will further facilitate the use of ARBs way down into CKD4, 5. Here I will also like to make one point, tongue in cheek. I'm sure there are a lot of good internists out there. I feel that this SGLT business will go right up to 5 to 10 ml of GFR. As long as you are producing a liter of urine, time will come when we will use this SGLT2. The reason I profess is, on a theoretical hemodynamic construct, if you have just 1 ml of GFR, you are still capable of producing 1440 ml of urine. Sounds very improbable, it possibly is, but on physiological models, 1 ml GFR permits you to lose 1.4 liters of urine. So if somebody is having 10 ml of GFR and he is producing 1 liter of urine, and if you put in an SGLT2 there, makes it 1.3 liters of urine, you give him another 300 ml of water, it's heaven for him. So I'm pretty convinced that this SGL2 business will go way down up to maybe 10 ml of GFR or whatever. And somebody very rightly said, right up to the door of dialysis.
So, Dr.
What-
Sunil,
what is a-
Dr. Sunil, one of my friends has posed in a question right now, so I'm asking you that at that 15 and 10 GFR, how much actual RAS system is left behind? Because eventually for heart failure also, it's going to be the RAS system on which a sacubitril valsartan or ARB is acting. So is there some RAS left behind that is going to make an impact on the heart failure?
See, when you are giving neprilysin, theoretically, you are trying to increase the natriuretic peptides. And we all know that the best way to lose sodium is to be able to throw sodium out, cause natriuresis at the lower possible glomerular pressures. And natriuretic peptides permits you to do that by shifting the curve slightly upwards and left. So although even if the kidney is dying, I would say that some benefit may accrue out of it. But these are very debatable questions that you can cut it either ways. On a case-to-case patient, what is most important is, supposing somebody is having side effects with ARNI or with sacubitril or with SGLT2, somebody has a bad genital infection, somebody has a euglycemic ketosis, you're not going to use it, right? So you cannot pitch it black and white.
So what is the role of hydralazine nitrate? You have stopped your nitrate in that patient, because we see so many people are starting nitrates alone. So, Dr. Prakash, what is your which patients will you recommend hydralazine nitrate?
You're asking, I have to answer.
Yes.
Hydralazine, see, as nephrologists, you will agree that we face very severe hypertensions. Worst hypertensions are with CKD. No nephrologist prescription for CKD will have less than 3 antihypertensives. And even we are persisting with clonidine, which have been abhorred by all and everybody. So hydralazine we do use now and then, but way back 10-15 years back, it went out of vogue, I think, because of some fears of some rapidly progressive glomerulonephritis and some issues with interstitial nephritis being driven by hydralazine and tachycardia. But in difficult cases, it is coming back, especially in combination with azosorbide. You also use it very often. And once in a while, we also use it. But for us, it comes way down. But if it is coming in package with the isosorbide, we continue.
Hydralazine ISDN combination showed some very fantastic benefit. The p-value was fantastic, which was not seen by any other anti-failure therapy, but in black population. So we do not know as Indian, we are black or white, or what percentage of black are inside, how much melanin our skin contains, we do not know. And secondly, I do not know hydralazine isosorbide dinitrate combination showed the fantastic benefit. In isolation, what is the contribution of each component? Whether hydralazine alone or ISDN alone will produce half of the benefit or no benefit, we do not know. And thirdly, in these cases, when pressure is the main problem, and those are very strong antihypertensive.
Yes.
So in these cases, these are not good because your pressure won't allow. Dr. Chopra, please.
The hydralazine isosorbide combination, as Soumitra has mentioned, it was tried years and years ago in black population in a very small number of patients. That was the only single study on which the recommendations have been made, and they are continuing. Subsequently, hydralazine went off patent and no company was willing to try that. And in fact, last year, Milton Packer wrote a very nice article saying that a combination which has been used by all of us, why don't we conduct a clinical trial on that? But you see, there's no money involved in that by companies. So at present, I don't think anybody is going to do that. Having said that, I think in our patients of renal insufficiency where hyperkalemia and other things are a problem, where we don't use ACE and ARBs we cannot use, there we still use this particular combination, and it gives reasonably satisfactory results. Of course, you have to watch the blood pressure.
So Dr. Sanjay Agarwal, he's the nephrologist from All India Institute of Delhi and has been very educative here. He says that tissue RAS is still there even though eGFR is very low, and many functions of ARBs, ACE inhibitors are through a tissue RAS system. So that is something which is important. That's why the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone axis has to be valued even in renal failure patients, and that's effective. Dr. Hari, as far as SGLT2 inhibitors are concerned, is there a definitive mechanism we know which is explaining the benefits in heart failure? There have been certain theories which have been given there, you know, the diuretic theory, the vasodilatory theory, the hypotensive theory, whatever. But is the metabolic theory significant enough? What's your
That is what Dr. Rosanna was saying. There are multiple mechanisms, and we don't know which works. So basically, when we initiate, I think the diuretic effect comes into, and we have to reduce the dose of the diuretics, and we have to be careful regarding the fluid status. That is very important when we initiate the drug. That is something we have to be careful. I think multiple mechanisms work, as you said. We don't know which is the better one, or which pathway acts at what time point in the therapy. That we don't know actually.
The diuretic effect is there in the beginning, and it's a strong diuretic effect. And as Dr. Harikrishnan said, you have to reduce. But remember, in DAPA-HF trial, even at the end of the trial, there was no change in diuretic dose. So it appears that the diuretic dose effect gradually wears off. The other thing is that with SGLT2 inhibitors, it is the interstitial fluid which is lost, not that much of intravascular volume. And since intravascular volume doesn't contract, there is no reflex sympathetic activation, and the usual tachycardia which occurs with diuretics does not occur with this. So there are a number of mechanisms. I don't think we have figured out even a small percentage of that. There are plenty
Sorry, I think there are two other mechanisms very fashionable nowadays to discuss. One is the erythropoietin rise, EPO rise, and more hematocrit, more oxygen. Another is very, very trendy is the superfuel theory, changing the substrate from glucose and lactate to ketone. And that gives a maximum ATP molecule per molecule, which may help in the failing heart with reduced substrate supply. So these are, as Dr. Chopra said, all theories, but each has got some contribution maybe in totality.
In this webinar in HFA, I asked Professor McMurray, I said, tell me, how do these SGLT2 inhibitors work? So he told me, with a smile, he said, Vijay, I'll tell you the same thing that I told you a year and a half ago. I don't know how they work, but so long as they work, we are happy.
Exactly, absolutely.
Sunil, what's your take? Why do the SGLT2 inhibitors work in the CKD? And the very fact here, the gist of this case was that the drug, the dapagliflozin or SGLT2 inhibitors have been there for a decade. Now it's getting off patent. The diabetologist was first to use, they never used it. For 4 years, we have been looking after this patient. No diabetologist, although they were looking at this patient, ever suggested any SGLT2 inhibitor. Cardiologist, for 4 years, we were using it. We were scared of using it. But nephrologist was the first one who stressed, try it. We may start with a smaller dose, 5 milligrams to start it. So what's your take in it? How does the SGLT2 inhibitors act and save kidneys? I mean, do you have the mechanisms there? Or what is your thought?
I think from renal point of view, we have 4 or 5 mechanisms. I hurried through my SGLT2 slide because time has to be respected. And number 1 is the class effect, that you have the distal convoluted tubule. It is loaded with sodium and water there. So it shuts off the tubuloglomerular feedback, causes the afferent vasoconstriction, reduces the glomerular capillary pressure head, and therefore reduces the attrition, reduces glomerulosclerosis, reduces the oxygen demand, reduces free radicals, and so on and so forth. There are many things out there. and other benefits on heart, antioxidant benefits. So I would say, yes, I'm optimistic about it. It does work, and obviously the diuretic effect, because once you lose sodium, the water will drag with it.
Dr. Mittal, Dr. Agarwal has a number of comments, and for the sake of learning, maybe if you can read them out.
Yes, I was trying to read them out. Now, know who Dr. Sanjay Agarwal is. He's a renowned nephrologist from AIIMS.
Absolutely.
So the first thing he says is DAPA CKD trial. Many patients actually have less than 30 ml of per minute of EGFR. And the second thing he said is a role of second generation iron in heart failure. It's very well established as for symptomatic improvement and all. This is by Dr. Keshav Budhotki. Dr. Sanjay Agarwal again said weight of the patient, and it is urea or a BUN value. So this was the urea value, which I was quoting, not the BUN. And the weight of the patient was constantly monitored and was kept within the range of that 0.5 to 1 kilos difference. There is no contraindications of ARBs in EGFR less than 20 ml. So that is what I was reading on to, that when we are talking about ARBs from the nephrologist perspective, that is something which they are giving. So why are not ARNIs? It's basically, that is the biggest question. The other thing which Dr. Sanjay Agarwal says is what was urine output on intake. So the output did improve when we gave 40 milligrams of torsemide, and this person lost 1.5 kilos of weight in 2 days. And then we reduced the dose to 20 milligrams once a day and discharged the patient. And we were following the weight very cautiously thereafter. Dr. Sanjay Agarwal said, why telmisartan inferior? So that is a big question which he asked. Any answers? Yes. The answers from a cardiologist perspective or heart failure perspective is that the tried and tested heart failure trialist medications, ARBs, are valsartan, losartan, and candesartan. The trials on telmisartan on heart failure population is not there. Hypertension, yes, but not in heart failure. That's why it is not a drug ARB approved of drug to be for heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. That's a conjecture. Well, it's only because the trials on this drug have not yet been done. If it was done, probably it would be as effective, but I do not know the answer. So the other thing which he asks is no cutoff. It is important for what purpose one is starting. So there is no cutoff, and that is what we have been discussing about. Urea of 34 does not go with creatinine of 2.9, more so in heart failure. Not possible unless muscle mass is very low. So that is a very important factor which was communicated. And last but not the least, he says, in CHF, urea is disproportionate, is high than creatinine, because heart failure acts as a pre-renal state and urea increases more than the creatinine. So that is what we expect. And that is why, that brings to my question. In our clinical practice, when we are dealing with a patient with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction with elevated creatinine, how do we define, is it acute kidney injury or it is a CKD if the only value which we have received is the one-off?
There are ways in which you can back calculate. If you have one value of creatinine, you can back calculate up to 7 days back that what could have been is starting creatinine, number one. So that way you can have some handle on it. And now if it is CKD or not, from the nephrologist perspective, if the urea creatinine is restricted to about a week to 2 weeks, we call it acute kidney injury. But if the urea creatinine rise is persisting to a month, it is now called acute kidney disease, AKD. And if it goes beyond 3 months, it is certainly CKD. 90 days, it is CKD. So chronologically, you can divide weeks, something AKI, a month AKD, and then CKD.
Right. So there is an important question by the audience. What about credence? Probably in our discussion, we completely ignored canagliflozin. Any comments on canagliflozin from the Credence trial by by Dr. Sunil and the panelists, please?
I personally believe all these drugs have similar class effects from the nephrologist perspective, whether it was Crescent, Credence, IMPA, DAPA. You look at the hazard ratios, you look at the risk reduction, they are like copy. I mean, they are literally the same. So I think it is the class effect. Personally, I am more into DAPA because it was the latest trial. Number two, they looked at non-diabetic CKDs also. Number three, in IgA nephropathy, which is one of the commonest forms of glomerulonephritis, it has been shown to be a good drug to use in IgA non-diabetic nephropathy. So we are getting to use more and more of DAPA. Personally, I was perhaps inhibited earlier by Cana studies in which they showed amputation were much more. But these are idiosyncratic thoughts in a prescriber. Personally, I think they're all class effects. I have nothing against or for Cana or for the other drug. But DAPA being the latest has kind of caught our attention more.
The last comment of Sasi Vali Shiv Prasad is correction of anemia is probably the greatest contributor for the improvement in this patient clinical parameters. Well, nobody can doubt that, but I mean, it's a correction of anemia which happened on day one, and now we are talking about 3 or 4 years follow-up of this patient, which is something which has to be quizzed about, that whether just correction for day one would have been effective so long. That is the concern. That's why we are talking about ARNIs, beta blockers, and now possibly SGLT2 just 3 months, but possibly
I think everything helps, sir. Everything helps, right from low salt, low fluid, good management, holistic management, looking at calcium, phosphorus, calcification, anemia. But I'm telling you, iron deficiency is a big thing now. Iron deficiency is really a big thing. 50% of people are iron deficient. Congestive cardiac failure. There's enough evidence.
Did
Call
you
it great
find
syndrome now.
iron levels again after giving the first time, or?
We normally in CKD4 give about a gram of FCM, which is a very safe iron, ferric carboxymaltose or ferric isosorbide. And the literature says you can give it in 10 minutes. Earlier, when I was a postgraduate, there were a lot of study that there will be free iron in the blood, and which is very oxidizing, and there will be iron toxicity. It will cause more infection. There were studies by Joseph S. Bash, one of the leading nephrologists in 90s. He showed that there were more infections, but that has not stood the test of time. The benefits of iron connection are far more. One should be aggressive about giving iron. At least
the side effects
CKD.
of iron depend upon the coating, not on the iron.
Correct. So now you have very safe iron.
Maltose is relatively neutral. But Sanjay,
very safe.
Iron studies subsequently or no?
Sorry?
Did you subsequently repeat iron studies or just give it once?
We did repeat the iron studies. They were very normal limits. That was done in last year. This time, the patient is going to come physically to me maybe next month after this COVID.
Generally, these people will keep on consuming irons, and you may have to give it every 3 to 6 months or something.
Exactly. So that's why we repeated last year. It was absolutely fine. And her hemoglobin has been 13 grams or so of late.
Sir, Dr. Sanjay Agarwal has raised his hand. Dr. Agarwal, you are there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Sir, you can start your video also.
Let's first thank you very much for all the insights and all the questions and all the suggestions you have put in the question answers box. Thank you for raising your hand, and we'll invite your comments if you have specific ones, please.
Yeah, I have one comment that at the start of the history, hemoglobin reported was 10.4.
Yes.
Which by definition even not anemia. So I wonder why was the need of giving injectable iron? The advice of giving injectable. So I wonder whether the hemoglobin was repeated. And I'm just saying that probably the benefit of IV iron we are overemphasizing in this patient.
So thank you for asking that question, Dr. Sanjay. Actually, in heart failure, there are so many trials on iron deficiency despite normal hemoglobin or less than 12 grams. We always make it a point in all heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. We do the iron studies because there is a huge population of patients who have normal hemoglobin, but yet they have iron deficiency. And iron is a component of a lot of other enzymes, not just the hemoglobin, which are important for the dynamics and the myocardial contractility and the other oxygen carrying capacities of the blood and so many other things.
Mitochondria and all.
Exactly. So that is why it's a matter of principle on our heart failure domain that whenever the person comes to us with any kind of borderline hemoglobin, we do iron studies and correct the iron for the symptomatic and functional improvement. At
It has
least.
also been seen that oral iron doesn't work in these patients. There are studies after studies that oral iron doesn't work. There are a number of factors, hepcidin, poor absorption, and so on and so forth. So
No,
intravenous iron is absolutely required in these patients to correct the iron deficiency.
No, I'm not saying that iron was not required. I definitely don't say that the oral will work. What I'm saying is attributing benefit to iron therapy. That is my
Yeah, it's one of the
question.
components.
Yes,
It's
yes.
not the only
I
component.
agree.
It's one of the
Yeah.
components.
We agree. We agree on that.
So we have to
So,
close.
yeah, I think it's already more than 15 minutes beyond time. It was to me, I enjoyed the presentation, the whole discussion. I thank Dr. Chopra. I thank Dr. Hari Krishnan for his wonderful presentation. Dr. Sunil, it was wonderful listening to you from the nephrologist perspective. We have been harping all together about the cardiology and heart failure, but it was wonderful, a breath of life to listen the nephrologist perspective and to have more confidence in basically treating patients with a little bit or even more reduced EGFR, not getting scared about it, watching for potassium and creatinine. Dr. Sanjay Agarwal also was instrumental in actually promoting the discussion. Thank you, Dr. Sanjay Agarwal. Dr. Sumitra Ray and Dr. Uday Jadhav, thank you very much for contributing for a meaningful discussion. I think I learned a lot from the discussion, probably others would have. Dr. Rosano, as usual, was perfect, phenomenal in his update on the latest data on the heart failure medications in chronic renal failure syndrome from the cardiologist perspective. Thank you very much. I hand over the mic to Gary.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.